Reading this essay by McMahan is like a certain seminar in a certain way of doing philosophy, and that is making rational guesses about the basis of things, like why death is bad, and then testing them against our pre-philosophical intuitions about things, and then adjusting then our philosophical guesses or our philosophical claims on the basis of what intuitively makes sense, sort of this balancing act. And I think that the last video dealt with a pretty clever example of this in McMahan's part of how it is we can make sense of our intuition that this person, Joe, did in fact suffer a tragedy, even though the event of his death was not tragic. And then the answer being that Joe's misfortune, which is the basis for his tragedy, is not the event of his death, but the fact that for a number of reasons his possibilities for future goods was closed off. And that seemed to help to make sense of our intuitions about the matter. But this does raise another problem, and that is we also have a strong intuition that when Joe dies at 30, that this is a more tragic event than when Jerry dies. I don't know how old Jerry is, but he's extremely old. Let's say that he's 112. That is, we have a strong intuition that a 30-year-old dying is a more tragic event, is a worse event, and that the 30-year-old's death is worse for him or her than the death of somebody who's 112. And that is very strong intuition. But as he said, an objector may say, and this is the bottom of page 254, but an objector might claim the fact that he, Jerry, the 112-year-old, would have had little to look forward to had he not died is, according to my view, itself a great misfortune, precisely the same misfortune I have claimed that Joe suffered. That is, if the 112-year-old Jerry dies of a heart attack, let's say, we could say that, well, had they not died of a heart attack when they did, they might have died a week later of a stroke. Like the young person, their death is causally overdetermined. But we say, well, it's different in that the death of the 112-year-old is much less bad for them than the death of the 30-year-old. But if we're saying that the causally overdetermined death of the 30-year-old, the basis of that misfortune is that in general their possibilities for the future were closed off, not just by the getting hit by a bus, but by the terminal illness that they had. Well, couldn't the very exact same thing be said about the 112-year-old? It's just that the causes are different. Old age being the major cause of this closing off of possibilities for the future, and that therefore Jerry, the 112-year-old, really did suffer the same level of misfortune that Joe, the 30-year-old, did. That is, if the misfortune consists in having your possibilities for the future closed off in general, not the actual event of your death, how you happen to die, then doesn't it apply equally to however old we are, to people however old? And this is definitely something that McMahan says has to be dealt with, because it doesn't jive with our intuitions, because our intuitions are that the death of the 30-year-old is worse, and worse for the one who dies than the death of the 112-year-old. So how do we deal with this? He says that what we should do is accept that when you die, if you die at 112, you do suffer a serious misfortune, and so that one could say that all of us, no matter when we die, that we suffer or we are deprived of the same amount of possible future experiences, and the possibility for those future experiences being closed off by one thing or another, either by terminal illness or just by extreme old age. But he says something interesting at the bottom of page 255, and that is the fact that we all suffer this deprivation equally does not, however, imply that we are all equally unfortunate. And that might be the basis of our intuition, that even if we allow that no matter how old you are deprived of the same amount of possible future experiences. The truth is that we don't regard the two people as equally unfortunate. And he says, consider the comparison between Joe and Jerry. Even if their losses are ultimately the same, their gains from life have not been. That is, he says, the explanation of why there is less reason to grieve for Jerry is simply that he has had a fair share of life. Relative to reasonable expectations, he has had a rich and full life. Joe's life, by contrast, has fallen short of what could reasonably have expected, what he could reasonably have expected to gain from life. So, in assessing the relative badness of two people's death, we don't just take into account, and this is sort of done on an intuitive level, what they have lost in terms of their future experiences. We compare what they have gained from their past experiences. So that he says, it is not unreasonable to measure the comparative misfortune that a person suffers in being deprived of future possibilities for good in terms of the extent to which the deprivation limits his gains from life, rather than in terms of the extent to which it increases his losses. That is, the loss is more or less the same on this scenario, but the gains are different. That is, Joe has had the gains that he could have reasonably been expected to garner from life limited to a greater extent than Jerry has had his gains limited. So it's an example of the way that a philosopher works, really. I mean, the way that a philosopher, like McMahan at least, is that this balance between trying to come up with arguments or rational reconstructions and comparing them to our intuitions on the matter, and giving a certain amount of authority to our intuitions on the matter, and thinking really that our philosophical accounts of these things have to jibe with those intuitions, which itself may be a kind of strike against Epicurus, given that his conclusion that death is not a bad thing for us does not seem to jibe with our intuitions, although I think I argued earlier that there is a way in which we could definitely say that Epicurus is right about death not being a bad thing for us, and we could also believe that continuing to live is a good for us, and that was I think a result of McMahon's reconciliation strategy.